I'm going to start off by telling you a little story about my very ancient past. In November of 1980, a week after the election that propelled Ronald Reagan into the White House, I left the New York Times for CBS News, where, as a newly minted network television reporter, I was assigned to the Northeast Bureau on West 57th Street. My cubicle happened to be right near the one assigned to another newly minted CBS News reporter, 10 months my junior. Eventually, I went on to Paris. My neighbor went on to fame and fortune as a 60 Minutes correspondent where, for the next 30 years, he amused, delighted, informed, and quite often astonished us with amazing stories. He was our first guide into the contaminated grounds of the Chernobyl nuclear plant. 2 years later, he brought us the defining moment of the 1992 campaign, his electrifying interview with Bill and Hillary Clinton that propelled them into the White House. In 2013, he was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by some other group. What was it? The Emmys. Together with all of the rest of his fellow 60 Minutes correspondents. Hardly distinguishing, right? Well, tonight, it's we Silurians' privilege to award Steve Kroft his own Lifetime Achievement Award that he will have to share with no one. So, now, as it happens, this is a special milestone for Steve and for us, since Steve is the 10th CBSer to win this coveted award, and it comes exactly 50 years after we awarded the first Lifetime Achievement Award to a CBS News luminary in 1969 to Walter Cronkite. So now, without further ado, it's time to bestow this award. Steve, come up here. You'll be crowned and all stuff, other sort of things. Pretty handsome, isn't it? This is great. Better than an Emmy. Wait, we have to turn for the camera. Okay, now I'm going to read the inscription on it. The Silurians Press Club Lifetime Achievement Award, presented to Steve Kroft in recognition of your remarkable career as a chronicler, investigator, 60 Minute stalwart, and steadfast exponent of the highest standards of journalism. October 16th, 2019.
You have to understand, I watch Mike Wallace in his 70s stand up and make some ad-lib speeches that he and everybody else at CBS lived to regret. And then there's this other factor about the correct choice of words these days. So I think it's better to think it through on paper before you actually stand up and say something that could spark a Twitter war or end a career or your reputation. I have to tell you, I'm reaching this stage right now. It's a phase of my life when people, some of whom I know, many of them complete strangers, come up to me on the street and they say, "You're on TV, I've seen you on TV, you're a reporter. Can you explain to me what's going on now?" The world seems to be unhinged. I think as a question, first of all, it's a little vague, not very specific. But the sad part really is that I know exactly what they're talking about. I think shock and collective anxiety may be the two things that are holding things on the East Coast together. Personally speaking, I'm not sure I really have the faculty to be surprised anymore. It feels like anything could happen in the next year. Impeachment, revolution, civil unrest, armed revolt, coup d'etat, war with Iran, war with China, maybe even war with Venezuela. And maybe a giant asteroid will come crashing into Earth within the next couple of weeks. Who knows? So many weird things have happened already, and Donald Trump is still president. It feels like a fever dream. I've been retired now for 2.5 months, and I'm trying to adjust to life as a civilian in I guess what they call the post-truth society, the post-truth era. I was doing actually pretty well, resting, relaxing, playing a little golf out in Sag Harbor, which is my new home with my wife, Jenny. We're trying to reduce our presence in the city. And the only really residual sign of stress that I've had have been sort of, work dreams. Work dreams, I'm sure you all have them, when you're on deadline and everything is going wrong, and you might lose your job, you might lose your house, your family, and then all of a sudden, when it gets to the point where the world is just about to crash down on you, you wake up and you say, thank God. It's a dream. And I go up, when I wake up, I say, I don't have anything I have to do today. This is the first time in my life, in 50 years anyway, that I've never had a deadline. I have no deadlines. I had no deadlines until I got a call from David Andelman. An old friend, we were both in Europe together. He was in Paris, I was in London, and I've known him for a long time. Good friend and colleague, and he wanted to give me a deadline. He wanted, it was a dinner invitation to be here tonight to talk to this distinguished group of journalists and former journalists in exchange for a free speech. And he said that this was the oldest press club in New York, or the oldest press club in the country? In the world. In America. And I thought to myself, well, I'm getting pretty old. What the hell? I'll just go. I was a bit apprehensive about actually have to write something down on my calendar because it was completely blank and I love looking at it. And I thought that it might disrupt my rhythm. But I reasoned it was probably time to sweep away some of the cobwebs on my brain, come back into New York for a few days. And so I told David I would accept if I could talk about, and he said, and I told him I'd accept only after he said I could talk about anything I wanted to, as long as it didn't go on too long and as long as I wasn't boring. So I'm not going to talk about President Trump. I'm not going to talk about Congress. I'm not going to talk about impeachment or post-truth America. If you're disappointed, you can always go home and turn on Fox, MSNBC, or CNN. They're all 24 cable operations. I want to talk about me, like David said, about my career. Some of my stories and tell you some stories about things that helped shape that career and what I learned along the way. I want to talk a little bit about what I did before I got to 60 Minutes, because everybody asked me that. Where were you before 60 Minutes? What did you do? In a lot of ways, I think it's the most interesting part of my life. I was born in Kokomo, Indiana, which is a farm and factory town north of Indianapolis, in August of 1945, a few days before the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I was a first edition baby boomer. My parents moved east when I was 16, and early and mid-60s, 1960s, I found myself at Syracuse University, a communication majors with not much conviction and no discernible interest in becoming a journalist. It was the golden age of advertising on Wall Street, and I wanted to go to Madison Avenue and write television commercials. I thought it was glamorous. I thought the job paid well. I had to take some journalism courses at Syracuse to fit the curriculum, which I did. And it was a good thing because those courses that I took in journalism really turned out to be my survival skill when in June of 1968 I was gobbled up by the U.S. Army in the largest draft call of the Vietnam War. Because of that background, and I think probably because they discerned in basic training that I was not material to be a platoon leader in Vietnam, the Army sent me off to its journalism and broadcasting schools, and eventually to a shack at the Public Information Office of the 25th Infantry Division in Cu Chi, South Vietnam, the place with all the tunnels underneath, where one of my jobs was to occasionally escort network television crews and reporters into the field. And I became really sort of interested in it. After 10 months, I'd landed a job with Stars and Stripes when my division was redeployed, which is the military newspaper, covering the war all over the country, right next to people from the AP, UPI, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the networks. It was a real journalism job. By the time I came home, I decided for a number of reasons that I did not want to write television commercials and that I really wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I spent a couple of years working at a Syracuse NBC affiliate where I covered the police and the court system and City Hall, where I learned a very important lesson from a bright, young, charming, an idealistic mayor named Lee Alexander, who was at the time also chairman of the National League of Cities and seemed destined for a bright future and a career on the national stage. A few years after I left Syracuse, to my surprise, Alexander was indicted for multiple counts of bribery and racketeering and did a few years towards the end of his life in federal prison in Minneapolis. The investigation had begun when one of the people who paid a bribe got a little greedy and tried to write it off as a tax deduction for consulting work. And it ended on a green at the Skaneateles Country Club with the arrest of one of the mayor's friends who had a golf bag stuffed with bearer bonds. It was a great story, and it taught me that even charismatic politicians lie, and not to believe a word any of them said. I spent a year in New York at the Columbia Journalism J School before going off to Florida, where I spent 5 years working at 2 radio stations that were owned by the Washington Post Company. The first in Jacksonville, and then the second one later in Miami. Both stations at the time, and this was during while there were still embers burning from Watergate, both stations were having their license challenged by wealthy groups of Nixon loyalists in both Jacksonville and Miami. They were, those 2 stations, the crown jewels of the Washington Post Company, the most profitable entities that they had, including the newspaper. And it was very clear that this was retaliation for Watergate. You may remember, I think we're all of the right demographic age group here, a phone conversation that John Mitchell had with Woodward and Bernstein, in which he warned them that if they printed this article he was talking about, that Katharine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post, was going to get, I'm sorry, her tit in a ringer. It was pretty racy for like 1973 or 1974, but nonetheless very widely quoted. And there I was, a witness to all of it, because it was going on right in front of me. Payback. When I got to Jacksonville from New York, the news director, who was very close to the people in Washington, there were always people coming down from Post Newsweek station, welcomed me and gave me 4 or 5 promising leads on corruption stories involving very prominent people in the community. It wasn't until the reporting was done, probably about a year later, and grand jury had been impaneled to investigate, that I realized that some of the targets of the investigation happened to be the very same people involved in the license challenge. I sort of knew that, but I never really thought that there was a clear connection now. But looking back on it, there's no chance it was coincidental. That taught me one lesson from Jacksonville: never underestimate revenge as a motive, and pay attention to cultivating important, well-placed sources. From Florida, Miami actually, I got a call from CBS News, and I went to work in New York as a reporter and then correspondent in the Northeast Bureau, next door to Mr. Hanneman. I spent most of my time doing stories for the Weekend News and doing long, elaborate stakeouts, including the stakeouts around the Dakota after John Lennon was shot, which was a particularly cold, miserable experience. So miserable that on the second day, the cops came up to us, and we were sitting in a car and with the heater on, and they said, "Okay, all you guys get out of the car. Get out. Nobody sits in the car anymore. You guys got to go. If I'm going to stand out in this cold weather, you're going to stand out here too." And if you don't like it, leave. And then I can go home. That was my first real experience with a New York City policeman as a representative of the press, but it stuck with me. I was liberated a few months later and sent off, given my own piece of turf, sent off to cover the Southwest for the CBS Bureau in Dallas, which was a great assignment for a young correspondent. Dan Rather had been there, Bob Schieffer had been there, a lot of people had been there. There was a lot of history and culture. It's a very strange place, very interesting. Terrible piece of real estate, but lots of stories, lots of tornadoes and grain elevator explosions. And then, of course, you had the oil patch. And the thing I still remember, I think, from that time in the Southwest was the first time I saw the Houston Ship Channel. If you've seen pictures of it. It's where all the refineries are. There's like a little ditch in front, and lots of these haul tension wires, and it smells terrible. I had a headache. I turned on my camera, and this grouchy old guy named Pat O'Dell. And I said, "This is the ugliest place I've ever seen in my entire life." He looked at me and said, "Son, this is what money looks like." And he was right. I did a year after that with CBS Bureau in Miami, covering cocaine wars in Dade County and guerrilla wars in Central America, mostly El Salvador, where I would occasionally run into Mr. Hogue. And after that, I went off to the London Bureau to cover the world, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and of course, Europe, where I learned about life, history, a little bit about art and wine. And the complexities of the European Union, which were laid out in the sign that hung on the desk of Jennifer Siebens, the Paris bureau chief at the time. I don't know if David remembers it or not. It read, "Heaven is where the chefs are French, the mechanics German, the police British, the lovers Italian, and everything is organized by the Swiss. Hell, however, is where the chefs are British, the mechanics are French, the policemen are German, the lovers are Swiss, and it's all organized by the Italians." That pretty much summed up my experience. In 1987, at age 41, I was called back to New York by Howard Stringer and Andy Lack to work on a new magazine show called West 57th, and 18 months later moved to 60 Minutes, where with Don Hewitt, the master, Mike Wallace, Morley Safer, Ed Bradley, Harry Reasoner, Andy Rooney, eventually Leslie Stahl a couple years later, on what was then and still is now, I think, one of the best programs on television. I was a kid then, the youngest guy on the show, straddling a culture in a generational fault line on the broadcast between those who thought rock and roll was here to stay and those who still believed it to be a passing fad. That was 30 years ago and 500 stories. It was a great run. It was a great run and a great deal of fun. I've flown to the middle of Force 5 hurricane with the Air Force, covered hijackings and hostage crises, famines in Ethiopia and Sudan, and wars on 3 continents. I've hung out with movie stars on the French Riviera, interviewed presidents and pop stars, watched a man die in a Chicago housing project, and a baby born to a midwife on the Rio Grande, all in the course of my employment. I think I'm pretty sure that the worst place possible for an airline to lose your luggage is in Anchorage, Alaska, because chances are pretty good that the plane you just got off is going over the pole to either London or Tokyo, and it's not coming back anytime soon. And if you've just arrived from Kuwait in the dead of winter, you have a wardrobe problem. I know what happens if you inadvertently return a Hertz rental car to Avis. Avis will continue renting it out, and Hertz will send you a bill for not just a full tank of gas, but for the whole sticker price. And that was sure to trigger a thorough audit by CBS of my entire expense account, which was not a good thing, not something you want. Looking back on all of it, it's just a blur. In the past, I've been constantly asked, what's your favorite story, particularly this year? I've always been partial to what I called secret bookcase stories. This thing from the old movies where you lean against a wall, all of a sudden it's a bookcase, and then or you take a book out and it revolves around, and then you're in a different part of the house that nobody knows anything about except the proprietors. Sort of like walking through the looking glass. But anyway, this is one of those stories. It's a bit long and twisty, but I think you'll see why I enjoyed it. I'm not sure it's my best, but it was certainly my favorite. I had a lot of fun working on it. I thought it was really important, and I learned a huge amount. It involved a Dallas company called E-Systems. If you've never heard of it, it's probably because the company and the U.S. intelligence agencies like it that way. When I was based in Dallas in the early 80s, I was vaguely aware of it. It was big. It had 16,000 employees. It was a publicly traded Fortune 500 company. It was sort of mysterious. Heavy security. No one knew exactly what it did. People who worked there said they couldn't really talk about it. Most of the work was classified. But people thought it was that E-Systems was absolutely the best in the world in what it does, but nobody was exactly sure what that was. I never gave it any thought at all until nearly a decade later when I was at 60 Minutes, and a high-powered lawyer from Houston named David Berg walked into my office with the damnedest story I'd ever heard. He had a client named Catherine Uribe, who had been holding her newborn infant, walking around a hotel room in El Paso when a bullet came through the wall and killed the baby. It came from the gun of a man named Truett Wayne Burney, who said the weapon accidentally discharged while he was cleaning it. Mr. Burney happened to be an employee of E-Systems and told the police that he needed the Glock 45 caliber semi-automatic weapon with hollow point bullets for his job. Now you can imagine David Berg, as attorney for the Uribe family, is trying to assess liability and was very interested in why an employee for a fairly obscure Dallas electronic company would need a Glock semi-automatic revolver with hollow point bullets. David Berg was unable to find out, although he was able to determine that Bernie was one of 5 E-System employees at the hotel that day, and that all of them were heavily armed, and that they were working with the U.S. Defense Department and several other law enforcement agencies. Other than that, every other question asked of E-System and the U.S. government about Bernie's presence in El Paso that day was answered with the refrain that we cannot tell you anything, it is classified. Berg said it was impossible to find out where E-System ended and the government began. He had already scoured the public records on E-System, and about the only thing he could find out was that the company makes all sorts of sophisticated optical and listening devices to spy on everyone from drug dealers to dictators to terrorists. It's outfitted the so-called doomsday plane that enables the President of the United States to command U.S. forces during a nuclear war if necessary. As a Fortune 500 company, we figured, we should be able to find out something about it. And we started talking to analysts on Wall Street who followed the stock. And the first thing they told us said, you should be aware that the public information about E-System is inherently unreliable because much of it is disinformation. That the company was suspected of concocting phony contracts with bogus names and paper trails to mislead potential snoopers inside and outside of the company. And this was at the directive and insistence of its customers, which include the CIA, the DIA, and just about every other intelligence agency in the U.S. government. E-Systems doesn't talk to the press. So here we had a publicly held company suspected of participating in a covert Defense Department operation in which an innocent American had been killed. And the lawyer, armed with subpoena power, could not get any information necessary to bring his case. We kept following it as it slowly worked its way through the court system. And on a couple of days before the hearing, we approached the federal judge in Houston and got permission to put cameras in the courtroom. And the next day, E-Systems settled the case for $4.2 million, and we were back sort of where we had started from. We kept following the case, and a couple of months later, we found another case, another lawsuit. It was filed by a guy named Erwin Rautenberg. He was in the air freight business. 20 years earlier, during the height of the Vietnam War, he had been approached by the CIA, and he was, I think, a first-generation American, maybe an immigrant from Germany. He was approached by the CIA, and he asked them for his help. They asked him for his help. The CIA needed a cover to conceal secret government shipments to Vietnam and to Asia, and needed his assistance. So Rautenberg formed a secret partnership with a company called Air America, a notorious CIA front company. Then, in 1975, after a series of scandals in Washington, the U.S. Congress ordered the CIA to divest itself of all of its front companies. And so the CIA sold Air America to E-Systems, which kind of blew my mind. And he got a visit, Rautenberg says in his lawsuit, that he got a visit a few days later from his contact with Air America, who said, look, everything's fine. It's going to go on just like it did before, only with E-Systems. And it did until 1981, when they decided that to terminate Rautenberg's employment. Now, the problem was he didn't go quietly, since he was owed quite a bit of money by E-Systems, and before that from Air America, not $1 million, but in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So he decided he would go to court, and he sued E-Systems. And that turned out to be a very similar experience, pretty much the same experience as the one David Berg went through. It went before a federal judge in Los Angeles. And very early on in the proceedings, the judge received a visit from the CIA. And shortly thereafter, he issued a secrecy order prohibiting Mr. Rautenberg or his attorneys from making inquiries about the relationship between E-Systems and the Central Intelligence Agency. Not only that, it was not just a secrecy order, it was a secret secrecy order, which nobody was to know anything about, and it was put in a vault in Los Angeles. And the judge, the federal judge, who was just about to retire, told us, he said, I can't even see it. If I need it to refer to it, and I haven't had a reason to refer to it since, but if I need to refer to it, I have to call them, the federal government, and they will bring it, they will bring it over with armed guards while I read it. Now, I don't know what's in that secrecy order, but it's still locked in that bank. And that was not the end of the story, but it was to the point where we had to write the story because we weren't going to get any farther. And we reported, the producer and I, Rich Bonin, reported all of the things that I've just told you. I thought that there was going to be, it might get, I didn't know what was going to happen after we reported. I thought we were going to get calls from the government complaining about it, but we never heard a word. Nobody complained about the story. Nobody said there was anything wrong with the story. The Texas papers ran a few stories, but there was silence in Washington, nothing. And I think that that was designed. I don't think anybody wanted to go any further on this. They had made their point. It was a very interesting story. As I said, I'm not sure it was my best story, but it was the closest I had come to getting into or a look at the secret black world that exists in the United States, and highlights how much stuff we really don't know. How many E-systems are there? What was Wayne Burney doing in, most likely, Mexico with all those armed weapons, and what kind of technology was there? I don't know. I do know that I don't think anything's changed. I went to the E-Systems website the other day, and it seemed very peaceful and placid. And they described themselves as a company that interacts with other companies in communication matters, and that everything was fine. Because I'd read an article earlier that said that after our story had run, that they were going to make some changes and really kind of try to deal with the public. There was none of that on the website. I also happen to know that a few years ago, E-Systems was sold to another company called Raytheon, which is an even bigger defense contractor with more secret equipment. And they don't really talk to the press either. And I thought I would share that with you. Not many people at CBS or at 60 Minutes right now even remember the story. It was done back in the early 90s. And it's kind of pertinent about what's going on right now with the committees in Washington, of which the intelligence committees have been heard and will be heard again before this is all over. So it'll be interesting. I'm happy to take some questions. Anybody?
Have you ever covered a story that you regretted covering and would take back if you could? The first one. Mm-hmm. And the other is, you've interviewed so many interesting people over the span of your career. Is there ever somebody you wanted to interview and it just didn't happen?
Yeah, everybody asked that question too. It's funny, I thought of somebody the other day who would be really interesting. I mean, there are obvious cases, like Madoff and people like that who are locked away in federal prison and are just not going to talk. I mean, they can't talk because you can't get cameras into federal prison anymore. There are plenty of people who are dead now that I would like to interview, but like Babe Ruth, for example, but he was dead before I was born. I mean, historical characters. And there are people that don't do interviews. Look, they're just people that don't do interviews. I'd like to interview the people at Google. I think there are a lot of questions to be asked of that company, and they're very unresponsive. They just don't talk.
What about a story you regretted? Can you take that?
Well, there was one story that we had to retract. I can't remember how long ago it was. It was a story that I really resisted doing. What had happened is that somebody came to us with a documentary that was about to air on one of the HBO channels, and they were friends with Don and Phil Scheffler, and it was a story about a guy smuggling. It was called The Mule, about a guy smuggling cocaine by swallowing balloons and following him on the plane and the whole thing. I really didn't want to do the story. I told them I didn't want to do the story. I thought that somebody had told me in London that there were major problems with it. But they insisted that I do it. We didn't really do very much with it. We did some narrations. We interviewed one person. We put it on, and then it fell apart. It was like a total fraud scam. I think all journalists make mistakes. There's nothing that I would say. There's maybe one story that I won't mention the people that worked on them with me, but they were very highly regarded producers. It was a story, one was of a former producer, but it was a story about King Hussein, and it was a story about the role that Jordan was playing during the Iraq War, and that they were letting all kinds of things into the country that shouldn't be let in. That was an embargo. And it was, I got more grief on that story than probably any other story I've done. Certainly long letters from all of King Hussein's friends, and he has many of them, including Jackie Stewart, for God's sakes. I had problems with it at the time, thinking, look, the Jordanians are like in a tough spot here. They just, they're there's just not much they can do. They depend on, they need Iraq, they need some support from, from the United States. And I thought the story was a little bit too rough. And that there was not enough context. I mean, we mentioned the situation that King Hussein was in. It would have helped if he had talked to us. He did not. But little, things like that, things that I'd say, things that I'd include in the story, maybe that I left out, things I'd take out of a story that I had in. I think about that kind of stuff. But there's nothing I lose sleep over.
Any event, anything that you covered, anything that you covered, any body that you covered that left you speechless?
I'm not very often speechless. I have a couple of former producers over here. Am I ever speechless? No. Okay. Huh? Right. There was a story. I think the story that affected me probably most was a story I did on 9/11 on a firm called Sandler O'Neill. That was up, on the top floor of the second tower, second to top floor of 98 or something like that. I can't remember what the floor was. Which lost pretty much their entire staff, 70 people, something like that. And we covered them. I knew vaguely the person who became the head of the company because two of the partners were, senior partners were killed. And listening to their stories and what it was like up there. And we were there for a week. Frank Devine, who was here, was one of the producers. And the things we filmed, like they had this big board up in these temporary offices where they had that was a schedule of all the funerals and making sure that there was somebody from the company at each one of them. People were pretty much devastated. It was an emotional, I don't know if you know if that's what you mean by speechless, but that I think is the story that probably affected me the most.
Steve, what do you think of this top secret cache of documents that Trump has established to hold these various conversations he's had with various folks, including the Ukrainian situation? These top secret cache, is the House impeachment inquiry ever likely to get access to these files in this top secret cache?
Well, I think that's sort of up in the air, and I think that's going to determine what happens with this investigation. I think it's all going to probably be, and it was not easy to predict, but the people who knew that were involved in Congress would tell you, said this is going to be a slow process because every time they refuse something, you have to go to court. I think that they can win in court. I'm not sure that they can win in the Supreme Court. I think they can win pretty far up. I think the tax case will be really interesting. That's been decided by a couple of different venues right now, and I think if that report comes out, the tax rates come out, see what's there. But I think there's a chance that they will get some of this stuff. I just don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do.
How much different in its interests and its techniques and its standards is the 60 Minutes that you left from the 60 Minutes that you joined?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think in terms of the standards, I think they're the same. In terms of the journalistic standards, I don't think they've changed. We still have devote a lot of money to doing stories. We still have a very rigorous fact-checking process. Our lawyers are probably a little less sympathetic to the correspondents and producers' interests than the previous set of lawyers that was there under Don. They were really great. They would say, I love this story. It's very solid. We just think you should say it this way, not that way. They would actively try and figure out ways for you to report the story. Now I think it's more like we don't want and this is still not terrible, they would rather not have a suit filed. The first set of lawyers in the law department were like, we'll go to court. We can win this case in court. We're not worried about that. Now, I think, probably because of economic pressures, they say, we don't want this case to go to court, period. We don't need people in the courtroom. That's a guess. But I will say, after having said that, we have a very good group of lawyers who are very tough and very demanding and demanding of accuracy. Other things have changed. When Don Hewitt left and Jeff Fager came in, there were changes that were made to the show in the way that it was organized. And that's not the same thing as the standards, but it affected people's lives. It was a little bit different. We used to have teams of producers working with one correspondent, and that system was broken up. I think because Jeff and Bill Owens wanted more input and control over what stories were done. Was it terrible? No. And I think if you look at anything that goes on right now in journalism, this is the hard part. If you look at anything that's in journalism right now, 60 Minutes is probably closer to what it was in those days than almost anything else. And I'm just not talking about journalism. I mean, it's probably changed less than almost anything in society over the years. I think it still sort of looks the same way. I don't know if this is a fair complaint or not. My impression is that we probably did more investigative stories 5 years ago than we do now. But I may be wrong about that. It's just, we still go after people pretty hard. And we've done some, every year, last season we did some great stories. I think people remember, and I'm guilty of it too, you remember what you want to remember from the Mike Wallace, Morley Safer, Dan Rather, Ed Bradley days. But if you go back and you look at those pieces now, they're not nearly as good as you remember them. I'm serious, they're not. The storytelling is sharper. So some of it is style. I think that it's not the same. Some people will probably like it less. Some people are perfectly happy with it. Some people probably like it more. But it hasn't changed that much.
One of the fascinating things to me over the years is the internal dynamics and frictions within the world of 60 Minutes. Extremely exciting. And I'm going to prelude it with in an odd way, but a few years ago I had a long conversation with Ron Ziegler. This was well after he left the White House, and the president he served, I seem to have forgotten his name, and I said, and it was a congenial conversation because this is long past, but I said, you people could have saved yourself an awful lot of grief and worry if you had gotten over this thing about being paranoid about the press out to get you every night on the evening news and every story. I would have loved to have taken you over any night during that period to a bar called the Slate around the corner from CBS News. And
I think I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, and the conversations you would have,
it actually had a CBS extension in it.
Yeah, exactly.
So if they needed to reach anybody
Yeah,
from noon on,
right.
they could call the Slate line.
And when Jimmy Clevenger was out of town, they had a cash flow problem.
Right.
But anyway, okay. But I want to get. But I said what you would hear. No one over there talked about let's get the Nixon crowd or let's get this. There's a little bit talking about beating the competition, NBC and ABC, but the center of their fury was why was his piece played tonight on the evening news instead of mine? And that would drive and fuel the arguments. And that, in my experience of observing 60 Minutes over the years, was one of the great dynamics of it. The internal competition of which not only the correspondents, maybe less the correspondents, but certainly the producers who worked for each correspondent were engaged very much in that intramural one. And I once had a long interview with Hewitt, and I asked him about that, and he smiled. He said, "And that's the way I set it up."
It is, and it was actually much more efficient for Don to run the show, because all he had to worry about managing, he left that up to the correspondents and to the producers to manage themselves, and he'd just go in and look at the pieces. That went away, really, I mean, honestly, when they broke up the teams. And I think that maybe Jeff didn't want that. I think that Don liked it. I think Jeff did not particularly like it. And I think that that might have been one of his reasons for doing it. He wanted to have more control. But you're right. When you had a team of people working, you all wanted to be on the air every week, and you were competing with the 5 other teams. Now, a lot of times the stories are decided weeks in advance, what's going to run. They're parceled out and assigned. I mean, used to be, we'd never had a story assigned. You had to come up with each team correspondent had to come up with their own stories. And that doesn't happen. That's not necessary right now. And the show misses that.
Steve, first, thank you for all your many good years of service. I know when Mary Jane and I watched 60 Minutes, we always said, oh boy, when you came on, you've done a really good job. What I'm curious about now is I really feel, as a journalist, and having been through a lot of years of journalism, that we're leaving an epoch and going into a new, darker one. I feel like it's almost getting Third Reichian in this country, and I think that it may be more dangerous, literally, for journalists covering stories in this country. I don't know if you want to reflect.
Being dangerous in which way?
Everybody's got a gun, put it that way, and they've got a person in the White House who's saying, go out and shoot them.
Well, I think in some cases, in some stories, probably that's a healthy concern. I mean, I think that's always been a bit of concern. Not so much, more getting beat up, mugged, having your camera broken, that kind of stuff, than actually being shot. But I think you still have to pay attention to where you're going and how you behave when you're there. And because I think there is always a threat. I think that it's very interesting. I think that I think people used to be pretty outspoken about how I think if you didn't like something, you could say something about it. I'm not sure that's really the case right now, in part because of the whole social media thing, in part of the fact that you could just end up getting killed and bullied and whatever, with no good reason. So I think there's a reticence to kind of speak out about certain things, because you know that it's going to just be brutal if once you've said it. You have to really want to say it badly and be prepared to gird yourself for the results.
How has social media affected the way 60 Minutes now covers the story?
I don't think it affects it at all, because I think for the most part, I don't think we pay much attention to social media, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing. I just think we kind of ignore it and do the way it's been worked, the way we've been working all along. But I think it's put us at a bit of a disadvantage in certain areas in terms of getting good stories out there and getting a secondary audience besides the very sizable one we have on Sunday night.
What's your favorite bit of advice Don Hewitt gave you?
Boy, I tell you, there was a lot of it. It was a pretty steady stream. It's hard to I can't think of one thing, but I have to say that Don was a very fascinating character. He could play lots of roles, and I think he played lots of things. He could get really angry, and then the next minute, he'd be fine. He'd run somebody through the ringer, and then 24 hours later, he'd be fine and pretended it never happened. He would scream at you about a story in the screening room if you got him on a bad, and make all these ridiculous changes that take the bottom and move it to the top, and the top to the bottom, and move the middle sideways, and that you come back out sometimes, particularly as he got older, and say, what was that all about? Then you'd go into Phil Shuffler, and he would just say, well, that's just on, you're fine, don't worry about it. some of these changes made. If you think it's really not going to work, show it to him, and he'll get it. Or if you want to try and come in and fight another battle, you can. But I think Don was very tolerant of a lot of things, and a very, very good manager. I think the place ran really well. He didn't have his finger on everything. He let the shop take its own, follow its own circadian rhythms. He would intervene if things got out of control or people had complaints. But he sort of was he sort of just sat back and waited for, if things got off the rail, he'd step in.
Steve, here you are retiring in the midst of what may be one of the most, how shall I put it, monumental elections with Trump and a lot of Democratic candidates. Shepard Smith just left Fox. You're gone. Aren't you going to miss being part of this situation now that we're a polarized?
If I was going to miss it, I wouldn't have done it. I think that I think I gave this a lot of consideration, and I think that this is my own personal point of view. There have been times, and I've told Frank Devine this, who's a Catholic. There have been times in the last couple of years where I felt like a failed priest who'd lost his vocation because I didn't like all the stuff that was going on, all the noise, all of the how much the profession has changed, and it has changed pretty drastically. It's not easy to report on Donald Trump. It's not easy to report in this atmosphere now, in part because there is so much noise and so many people doing different stories. I thought I was going to get into this a little. I intended originally to get into this a little bit tonight when I spoke, and then I thought it was too complicated, and I didn't. But to me, one of the biggest things that's changed, that I think that the traditional American form of journalism is not dead, but it's way, way, way out of fashion. The idea that you go out and cover a story and you come back and you try and be objective, it's hard to be objective. I don't know what that word means, but at least fair and balanced, and to put things in context has given way to another genre of journalism, which is advocacy journalism, which is based on a very different principle, which is you don't want one or two or three stations being careful. You want sort of everybody doing what they want to do, and there'll be a diversity of opinion and people choose what they want to do. So what you've got is all this fighting going on. That adds to the noise and to the divisiveness. It's so divisive. Adds to the divisions in the country. Yeah.
Did you ever think you would see anything like that with a president making statements on Twitter?
Well, since I've never tweeted and decided fairly early on that I was not going to participate in this, that I thought it was a no-win situation and I couldn't see the point of it. I didn't. So is that, yeah, I think that's kind of stupid. I think it's kind of dangerous. But what I mourn is the fact that there used to be the advocacy journalism was always a side dish. It's always been a side dish, or a side course. Sometimes a main course if the story was really good, on the menu of the New York Times and the Washington Post and all these papers. Everybody did it. The networks did it. Everything. Now you've got all these websites. Lord only knows, who's behind them. What they're, in most cases, they all have in order to get clicks. The more outrageous, the more clicks they can get. I mean,
So,
the system, the economic system for the internet is really foobarred.
what should journalists' response to the words fake news be?
Well, it turned out, it took me a long time to try and figure out exactly what it means, and I think it's one of those words that means different things to different people. I always thought that it means something that was not just definitely not true, that was being put off as being true. That's hard to police. It's really hard to police. I mean, I'll just say, the thing I find most depressing Take infrastructure. I watched two presidents run, or really three presidents running on doing something about the infrastructure in this country, which is really falling apart. There's nothing but support from it, from the labor unions to the Chamber of Commerce to the people in the Republican Party, and they can't do it. They don't want to do it. They won't come to terms with it. They won't find the money that needs to be done to do it. And they're just going to have to do them at some point, and they're cheap. It's cheaper to do it now with the interest rate so low. I don't understand it. And it's frustrating. And there are all sorts of issues like that. Education. Just things that need to be done that we're not paying attention to right now because we're wrapped up in the election and we're wrapped up in politics.
Well, I can't think of a better way to, a more depressing, but enlightening way to end.
No, if you want to ask me something, and I'll say something good. Look, I think we're still here. I get to the, and I wasn't joking.
Here.
I wasn't joking when I said that I think some of the collective anxiety is holding things together on the East Coast. I said this to my wife the other day. I said, I'm worried about this younger generation because of the ideas that they have. They want to try all these other things, and for the most part, they have no sense of American history. Nobody has a good sense. No, it's not just the young kids. Nobody really knows very much about American history. And we have a history of dealing with things and raising these issues, and they come up. Sometimes it takes a long time to get them done, but you can make progress. And we need to educate the young people on that subject. And my wife says, "Jesus, you're talking like an old white man." I kind of wilted, and I thought, well, I guess I am. I'm a poly. And I right now I have no agency to speak as an old white guy.
You have plenty of agency to speak to us anytime, Steve. And congratulations.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
Thank you. This was magnificent. And all I have to say right now is, Steve, what you have to do is you have to get your next career, and 20 years from now, come back and collect your second Lifetime Achievement Award. So how's that? Thank you.